Hey, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you're tuning into this episode. We are a viewer and listener supported podcast, so we really appreciate you listening, watching on YouTube. We really encourage you to subscribe to whatever platform you're using. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, or if you're on Apple or however you listen to a podcast, be sure and subscribe. We greatly appreciate it. Also, make comments if you like it and share it if you like it. We really need people to make comments and share the episodes that you like. And then also, if you're not already a supporter, we really would encourage you to go to spiritualityadventures.com and you can pick a tier, and we have bonus content for every type of giver. This is a nonprofit, so they're tax-deductible donations, but we do provide bonus content for those who are supporters. So be a part of the team, help support Spirituality Adventures, and we're so glad you're tuning into this episode. Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. Thanks for tuning into this episode. I am excited. Josh Paszkiewicz, got it. Josh Paszkiewicz, I had to work on that one, is here. And I tell you, Josh is easily one of the most educated people, not only doctorate degrees, but lots of master's degrees, and then lots of certifications. Yeah. And then the breadth of his experience and his education. When I was reading it all, I thought, this guy's got to be 85 years old. And he's only 35. So he has packed a lot into his short life, and I am excited to have. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And by the way, we're really just met physically for the first time right. Today, right? But his husband, Zach, and I met maybe 2 years ago, and I kept trying to get Zach on here, and then he says, you need to get my husband on here. And so I was like, okay, I'll do it. And then when he started telling me about Josh, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, let's get Josh on here.
He's thankfully my biggest supporter with all that. That's all my PR for me.
Yeah, so thank you for doing this. Yeah, I always like to start with kind of your origin story, like where were you born, where did you grow up, and give us a little sense of your family background, and maybe edging toward your spiritual upbringing as well.
They're inseparable for me.
Yeah, okay, me too, yeah.
Well, I was born in Würzburg, Germany, to two military parents. So both of my parents were in the Army. They were both mental health clinicians in the military, worked for the Army's psychology service.
Wow.
So that's an interesting place to start. Didn't live in Germany very long. So my mom had gotten out right after I was born, or maybe right before my brother. That part's not clear to my recent memory, because I have a younger brother who was born a year later. So we came back to the States, ended up in Oklahoma. My younger brother ended up being born in Oklahoma, and kind of lived around the military, I guess, until we were about 5, something like that. My mom's family's from upstate New York. Dad's family's from Kansas City. So we were living in upstate New York for some time. And then my dad started kind of having a colorful mental health journey in some ways, which ultimately led to his kind of coming back to the VA and seeking some institutional help for that. And ultimately, my parents got a divorce. At the time, I didn't know why, but, Dad would actually come out of the closet years later. And so that was a big thing, because he came from a very conservative Catholic.
How old is he?
60 now. 60.
Okay, he's my age.
Yeah. So it was a different, journey he was going through.
Definitely.
And that was not something that went over well with anybody.
I bet.
His family, my mom's family, my mom, who was just pretty distraught over that. She had 2 little kiddos and then was getting a divorce and, trouble there. Mm-hmm. So we ended up staying in upstate New York for some time with my mom's family. But, upstate New York is economically, northern Appalachia, in every way. And there's just not a lot going on. And so I think
dairy country, maybe.
It's
something.
There's some of that, but not. The main industry is law enforcement, and they have a lot of the state's mentally handicapped adult population, developmentally delayed folks that they take care of, who are wards of the state. So there's a lot of sort of home-based care in group homes and hospitals. And so it's healthcare or law enforcement. That's pretty much what you do. So seeing kind of that on the wall, Mom ended up coming back down here, wanted us to be able to have a good relationship with Dad and that sort of thing. So we ended up back in Kansas City, which is ostensibly where I grew up, the greater Kansas City area. You've got to be a little bit creative with it. And so for obvious reasons, folks weren't in the church. Dad wasn't going to the Roman Catholic Church anymore, which was the background. And Mom didn't want to reconcile with it either, wasn't going to seek an annulment. Neither one of them wanted to claim some wrongdoing to get the sacramental boop that says you're free to move on with your life. So kind of went through a period of not having a ton of church involvement. Christmas and Easter, Catholics go to the high holy days, if you will, and check in. At some point along those lines, my great-grandmother had passed away, and she was kind of the matriarch of my mom's family and really, for all intents and purposes, raised my mom. And that was kind of like a big crack for her life, just like questioning everything. What is going on here? And she's pretty young, so certainly younger than I am now by a decade or more.
Okay.
So at that point in time, the Jehovah's Witnesses had come knocking on the door and caught my mom just at the right moment of grief. And that was the thing, so, how do you want to be together in paradise with your family forever? Let's make that happen,
Let's make a deal.
Mom was real receptive to that. Her new husband at the time was definitely not. I think he was raised Presbyterian and didn't participate for a long time. So there was some trouble there. But Mom really got very active in it. We had the in-home Bible studies with the Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeah. Mom eventually got baptized, and there we were 5 times a week at the Watchtower Society until I graduated high school, actually. So 4th grade on up, I was raised in the
What part of the
Society.
city was that?
So that was down in Butler, Missouri. So Bates County. We actually lived really on the fringe of Bates County, but I ended up going to high school in Butler, Missouri.
Okay.
I'll never forget my dad's response to that was, and agnostic at best, that cannot be the only expression of Christianity that you're exposed to. So he had found what was then called the Country Club United Church of Christ in Kansas City, kind of the Brookside area, across the street from where Zach works, actually. And that he took us there every other weekend as visitation allowed, so we would kind of get some counterbalance.
Was it UCC?
UCC Church, right. They're now Kansas City UCC.
Right.
Had a great minister there that was, I must have been a weird kid, in so many ways. But I remember my dad, I was at home, his house for visitation one week. He's like, the minister called for you. It's like, you're 12. What is going on? But, there's a lot of internal polemics between this Roman Catholic background and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the very socially progressive UCCs at the time. Yeah. They were, I think, the first, what they called open and affirming UCC Church in Kansas City.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. So that was like where LGBTQ folks could go and just be themselves and be welcomed and have a church life, and it wasn't always super harmonious, it was the 90s, right? So people were figuring out, but they were really, vowed to do it together. So, That went on that way for a while. I remember our wonderful minister there, Sue Thorne, who's long since retired, but was just such a godsend to my life, introduced me to John Shelby Spong, who was an Episcopal bishop,
right.
Kind of, I would say, the successor to Paul Tillich. And so that was what I read at 12 and 14.
Jesus Seminar guy.
West Star Institute sort of stuff. So I found that just mind-boggling.
Interesting. Okay.
And long story short, I just kind of was bouncing around.
You were reading that at 12?
I was.
Come on, man.
Strange.
No wonder you're in the midst of society, right? You're 12-year-olds reading. Yeah. Anyway.
Tillich and Spong. Like I said, I was a weird kid. So kind of got through high school. I had been introduced to martial arts when I was a really young kid. I just always had an affinity for East Asian culture, and that was something I pursued in earnest, and my parents really both supported at different junctures, but that kind of got me exposed early on to Buddhist philosophy, which I thought
through Taekwondo.
Through Taekwondo, through martial arts. So there's, in the Taekwondo school that I grew up with, there was this thing called the Hwarang-Ulge, which was these mythological Korean warriors that had these 5 precepts that they followed, and we had to recite those things in our dojang. And they were written by a Korean Buddhist monk, Wan Hyo. So there was this, sort of ancillary training, but we also did, meditation before and after class. So it was just a kid like miming the teacher, but it planted some seeds.
Yeah.
So
Fascinating.
by the time I graduated high school, I'd had enough of Christian rhetoric and decided to really immerse myself in that. And there's a number of ways I got there that are kind of colorful. Going to theocratic ministry school with the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Wow.
And learning how to minister to Buddhists, and they didn't have a lot of good ammunition. And I remember reading that book and being like, this makes a lot of sense. So that's where I went after high school. And that kind of got me to being a young person. Yeah.
Where'd you go to college?
Well, kind of all over the place. So I had an interesting situation. And that I was, we hadn't passed this legislation these days where you could have health insurance and things like that. You were 26 and be supported in school. But there was enough situation. I couldn't really afford to go to college. The Jehovah's Witnesses proactively don't want you to go to college. It's not allowed. It's too worldly. And that'll get you booted, but I was already in that arena. And parents couldn't afford to pay for it, but I was still beholden to their income to figure it out, right? So I actually kind of put the damper on that. And instead of going straight to college, went to a Buddhist monastery in essence, started training around the country with different Buddhist teachers and becoming a monk in short order. That was my first foray out of high school.
That's wild.
Yeah.
I've hardly met anybody who grew up in southern Missouri who went to become a Buddhist monk after high school. You're the first. So it's good. There's going to be a lot of firsts here on this one. So that's great.
Yeah.
So how long did you do that?
So that was pretty much, up until recent history, I was very much still involved in that kind of as a at least partially full-time endeavor, but certainly made time for other things. Kind of did their equivalent of what would you consider seminary training. Wasn't in any formal accredited program, but eventually found my way leading a couple congregations here in Kansas City.
Like Buddhist
like
congregations.
Sanghas. Yeah, Sanghas, right,
okay.
Right.
By the way, Sangha is the Pali word?
Sanskrit and Pali.
Sanskrit and Pali for basically community.
Community,
right?
Yeah, right.
Similar to Kohelet in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because we apply it.
Kahal is the Hebrew word for assembly or community. And it's
the same, yeah.
And then it got translated over into ecclesia in the Greek, which Ecclesiastes, and that's community basically. So Sangha is the
Buddhist equivalent. Yeah, it literally means assembly. It's interesting though because we, through our Judeo-Christian lens, often interpret that word as being a little bit more egalitarian than it is. Right? It doesn't Sangha.
Okay.
It doesn't actually mean assembly in the same way. It meant the assembly of the monks and nuns. So it was like this is Buddhism. To be a Buddhist, you take these 3 vows about refuge in Buddha, the teacher, the ideal, refuge in Dharma, the teachings, and refuge in Sangha, the community. But actually, in context, it would mean the teachers. So it's kind of a neologism to apply it in the way we do in the West as Sangha. But and long story short, without being too pedantic. So I was leading a few communities here. I had started running around the Episcopalians a little bit. Maybe that Jack Spong seed was planted early, and discovered clinical pastoral education. And was really trying to find, as a young person who had these bizarre credentials and bizarre social standing, how do I have some peers? How do I develop some collegial relationships? And that was kind of floated as, well, mainline Protestants all do this, so maybe do that. And I did. And that was kind of what flipped the switch and brought me into, okay, now I need to get a seminary degree and do all these things.
Yeah. And So you ended up going to getting a Master of Divinity? Is that what you did?
Master of Arts in Religion.
Okay. Where did you do that at?
So Graceland University, the Independence campus.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you ended up doing a Doctor of Ministry, which I did a DMin at Fuller Theological Seminary.
Yeah.
You did one.
So College of Pastoral Education and Supervision. So that was actually an in-house degree that CPSP put together. CPSP is one of the 2 largest accreditors of CPE programs, which is typically hospital-based, clinical training programs for pastoral counselors and clinical chaplains. And so our branch was very much involved specifically in the psychodynamic field. And the powers that be were trying to find some, like the DMin programs didn't fit what we were doing, but they wanted us all to have access to that and tried to build some relationships, but couldn't get us. They said, what, we can create our own program. So they did. And it was really great. I had a chance to study with, honestly, some of the more weighty and important voices in the field, some of whom are now in their, late 80s, early 90s. And had been doing it almost since the beginning of it, in this country.
So it was a pastoral care and counseling track that was rooted in psychoanalysis.
Psychoanalysis,
basically. Yeah.
And of the Freudian variety, unabashedly,
Really? Not Jungian, but Freudian?
Nope, they would definitely Freudian. Jung is the easier route, but Freud, that's a whole conversation. But Freud had one of the earliest lay psychoanalysts, Oscar Pfister, was who Freud approved as a psychoanalyst who wasn't a physician.
By the way, there's a new movie out.
Yeah, I saw it recently.
I haven't seen it yet, but somebody said it was amazing.
I think it was great. Yeah, theoretical conversation between Freud and C.S. Lewis.
Yeah. Was it interesting?
It was good. But the caveat I would give, even as something of a Freud nerd, you really have to be rooted in not only, Lewis's life in person and work, but Freud's life in person and work, and his daughter. It's not all expressly mapped out. So it's a little heady, but it is a great movie. Yeah.
I would know C.S. Lewis way better than Freud, but certainly know Freud and Jung fairly,
Well, and that was
not in depth. But
what played with that was, Freud was not totally antagonistic toward religion, in the way that he would refer to himself as a godless Jew, but that was his own life, But the first lay analyst was a Protestant minister, Oscar Pfister. So that's kind of interesting.
I always have thought that I've always think that there's legitimacy to the psychoanalysis route of counseling, and we used to call it those early people who jumped into the inner healing. So it was sort of like they baptized Freud into a Christian context and
there was a whole movement
called it inner healing.
The American Pastoral Counseling Association, I think that there was originally. I
can go back to like Francis McNutt would have been an early, and in my vineyard background, Francis early on would speak at our vineyard conferences. Really? Yeah. Richard Rohr was a charismatic Catholic who dove into that. He
very familiar with Richard Rohr's
becoming more Jungian, right?
Yeah.
But it's anyway.
That's cool. I love those connections. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So give me. So have you lived in a monastery in Asia?
I have. Yeah, I spent about a year in India in particular, and I've spent shorter terms largely in Vietnam and Taiwan.
And we're all. So I'm still I could tell you every kind of Christian on the planet, and give you all the history and background because that's my world.
Yeah.
But I'm just now in a 2-year training with Tara Brock and Jack Cornfield doing their MMTCP program. I'm in my 2nd year now with them.
Great.
And I think it comes out of Vipassana tradition.
Yeah.
But I couldn't tell you the difference between what I'm doing and your Zen Buddhism or any of the types. I know there's probably as many types of Buddhists as there are Christians, maybe.
Well, what I tell people is that there's more. So, Buddhism is around 2,600 years old, right? We look at Christianity and you can go Orthodoxy, Catholicism, the Protestant Reformation, all those things that branch off there. Yep. We've had 600 more years to branch, and we have. So I don't know if it's quite as diverse, but it's actually, in practical terms, very similar. But I think I can wrap that up coherently in a short form.
Because I'm still feel like I'm, walking in the woods and can't see the big picture yet.
Well, I've been trying to translate this to Western audiences for a long time. So for those theologically minded folks that would be familiar with these terms, I think we can make sense of it real quick. There's essentially 4 movements of Buddhist doctrine and practice, right? So, and I think that there's Christian analogs to each of them. So we essentially have Theravada. That's where your Vipassana tradition comes from. So Vipassana is a technique in the Theravada school. Theravada means the way of the elders. And so it's orthodoxy. We could consider the Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, kind of the group of practitioners that are trying to do things as close to what they believe the Buddha and his disciples were doing at the time. And they try not to change it, and they try to maintain a high level of fidelity to it. There were a lot of problems with orthodoxy in the Buddhist sense, largely because the precepts that the Buddha prescribed for the monastic community, and they were all monks in the early days, were pretty strict. They weren't allowed to touch money. They had to beg for their food, their alms, and a lot of culturally sort of bound activities that were to their region of what some scholars would say the Indus River Valley. So as Buddhism started growing outside of that area, and the Buddha passes away, especially after that point, they don't have an authority figure. By the way, for folks,
Buddha would have lived 500 years before Jesus?
500-600,
500-600 years before Jesus in India, right?
Yeah, modern-day Nepal.
Modern-day Nepal. Okay. Oh, yeah.
So he was a great authority figure, grew a great community. They did a lot of, I think, revolutionary things that still are revolutionary.
Even when I was like a very conservative evangelical who read, I was always into the intellectual evangelicals, right? But even when I was studying Buddha I was a religion major at Baylor, and I was like, dang, this dude figured out a lot of stuff just sitting around thinking.
The Jehovah's Witnesses even thought that much,
I mean, it's like amazing just to be, the things that he came up with based on reflection,
observation,
and observation, and the human condition,
right?
And he obviously blended it with Hinduism to some
I would
degree,
say to a large degree. Maybe this goes to the next point of this sort of schema.
I don't mean to interrupt you. So the first one is orthodoxy.
Orthodoxy, Theravada, the way of the elders.
Yeah.
They started not being able to follow all their own precepts. It was a little bit oppressive. The monks moved out of these areas that had an almsgiving tradition. They started receiving money. They weren't even supposed to physically touch it. Now we can't even be monks anymore. Enter the Buddhist Protestant Reformation. So this is what's called Mahayana, the greater vehicle, as the Protestant Buddhists would say, to the way of the elders. And this is pretty much, so Theravada Buddhism is found, actually not in India, but that's a long story. It's getting reintroduced. Southeast Asia. So we're thinking Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, Burma, this region. That's where it's kind of maintained. Certainly it's in Nepal still, but anyway. Mahayana is pretty much everything in East Asia that is not that, with notable exceptions. So this is China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan. They all practice this sort of reformed school that really took on a totally different, more colorful, syncretic character in some ways. So there's the Reformation, and this is probably the largest group of Buddhists worldwide. Then there's the Buddhists everybody knows about. His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He is the head of the Gelugpa, the yellow hat sect of Tibetan Buddhism. These folks are a little bit harder to classify, but we could maybe call them a syncretic tradition that's analogous to Santeria. It's kind of orthodoxy mixed with indigenous shamanism. Okay. And in fact, the first scholars of that school, when they encountered it in Bhutan, Tibet, Mongolia, that's the main region, they didn't even recognize it as Buddhism because it was so syncretic. And actually, Tibetan Buddhists are 1% of world Buddhists. So everyone knows the Dalai Lama. Probably the smallest group of Buddhists are the Tibetan Buddhists. But so they're kind of this syncretic, Santeria-like tradition. And then enter the Zen folks, which is the school that I was trained in to come from.
And Zen master.
Yes, that's a turn of phrase.
Tell us about Zen and then tell us what a Zen master is.
Okay. Sure. So Zen is, if we can put it in Christian terms, it's a restoration tradition. So it looks at this syncretic Santeria sort of thing. It looks at the Mahayana innovations. It looks at the orthodoxy and says, I think y'all are missing it. So let's kind of go back to what we think maybe the Buddha's intentions was. Some varieties of Churches of Christ can be associated with that, the Latter-day Saints. There's a lot of variety that consider themselves restorationists.
I'm now a ordained DOC, which is a part of the restoration.
Exactly.
Christian Church Disciple of Christ. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so I had some appreciation for that from my UCC days. So I remember that.
And we're in full fellowship with UCC.
Right.
So, anyway.
Yeah, great group. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the Zen folks out here kind of are having this renewal movement, restoration movement, back to the basics, but none of the continuances they thought were it. And so in a lot of ways, it's very simplified. It's a very simple technique. Zen comes the word zazen, sitting meditation. It just means meditation. Certainly it's got its own colorful elements. But anyway, so what is a Zen master? Well, it's a very bad translation. That's what that is. We might think of it as like a master carpenter, right? Or a master plumber, right? We think Zen master, this is some guru, and sometimes treated that way. But it literally means you've mastered the forms, that you've been entrusted by your community, and other people have been trusted by their community, and almost a cyclic succession from the Buddha, saying that, yes, you get what we're doing, and you can hand that off as a lineage holder. So the tools of the trade are at your disposal. Now, whether or not you live up to using them appropriately is up to you, right? So there's a few of us that have those titles, and it's not always pretty in what you would expect, but alas, religion.
So I'm going to pick a few famous figures, and you tell me which of these four schools they would fit into.
I'll do my best.
So Thich Nhat Hanh.
Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese Buddhism, Mahayana. Actually, but also, so Zen, sometimes people put Zen as a subset of Mahayana.
Okay.
He was a Zen master, Thich Nhat Hanh, but probably would be more associated with the Mahayana school.
Okay. And then what about, I'm going to blank on it. I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. The dude that, I think he just passed recently, but he was one of the Harvard dudes that was experimenting with LSD. He's got a Jewish background.
Oh, Ram Dass. So Ram Dass studied with a guy named Neem Karoli Baba, who was a Hindu guru. He wasn't even Neem Karoli Baba's longest disciple, but he was the one that made him famous in some way. So he was not a Buddhist officially, but certainly flirted with Buddhist concepts, as many of Neem Karoli Baba's students did. So somewhere in the mixture of not anywhere, but also circumambulating Mahayana, I would think.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Interesting. Obviously, they've had a lot of influence, I think, in the West, right?
Very much
Ram
so.
Dass, Thich Nhat Hanh, I think even the Dalai Lama to some degree.
Oh, that's huge, I would say. Yeah.
Influence. Who are maybe a couple other the Western influencers who
Oh
would
goodness,
fit into one of those?
I think that outside the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh, you start getting kind of obscure.
Okay.
But I mean, there's people that have certainly had their moment of fame. Zen Master Seung San, a Korean missionary, came here in '68, built something like 112 congregations in his lifetime. Very famous. Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, Japanese Zen master, famously wrote Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, huge text.
Out
of the San Francisco Zen Center.
Okay.
Both of those folks would be Zen, Korean and Japanese Zen.
Mm-hmm. So when you spent time in the 3 different monasteries in Asia, which 3 locations were you in, and were they all in?
So actually,
were they all Zen Buddhists?
Yeah, no. So I spent a lot of time in India. Like I said, a whole year there. It wasn't in one monastery. I was actually a traveling monk. So there's a tradition for some monks and Hindu gurus as well, sannyasis, to not stay in a place longer than 3 days. That's part of the spiritual discipline. So I was bouncing around with a sannyasi as a personal attendant from monastery to monastery all over India. And so stayed in bunches of monasteries there. Same thing in Vietnam. I've been invited at the host of the Vietnamese government, actually, for United Nations World Day of Vesak that we held in Hanoi, I think in 2018. So I've been paraded all over Vietnam, but spent probably the most time in Hue, central Vietnam, which is kind of their epicenter of Buddhist culture. Same thing in Taiwan, have all over Taiwan, which is, it's an island you can circumambulate in a day. So it's a second circumambulation in this conversation. I'll try to limit that, but yeah. So just kind of a bunch of different monasteries in short.
Okay, cool. So, so were you living had you taken a vow of celibacy
at that time,
this period of time in your life?
Yeah.
And that's required, right? That's one of the
it depends
vows.
on school. So in the Theravada school, absolutely required. And the Mahayana school, it's required half the time. And the Vajrayana school, pretty much not required. And the Zen school, also pretty much not required.
Okay.
So that was one of those kind of things that as we examined it over time, it's like, this seems to be more of a cultural predilection and a cultural custom rather than something that has doctrinal scruples.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then where would a guy like Ken Wilber fit into this picture?
Well, Ken Wilber,
people might not know, but he's written a lot of books. I think he's had some pretty big Western influence and wrote his biggest, probably what he calls his magnum opus, which is this thick. It's called Religion of Tomorrow.
Yeah.
And and I liked his 4, I can't remember what he called it, but growing up, waking up. He has
that scheme. I know what you're talking about. I couldn't quote it to you either.
Yeah.
No, Ken Wilber's an interesting guy. It certainly has had, I think, a bigger effect on sort of the academicians among mystical and contemplative religion. I mean, it's dense. Getting into his stuff is just such a high level intellectually. I would say stimulating, but certainly dense tome that he's written many. I don't think we can fit neatly into a Buddhist schema because he really draws freely from not only the East Asian religions broadly, but also Western philosophy and Western religion as well. Okay. I mean, I would say Wilber's the great syncretist of our time and unfortunately underappreciated,
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Do you know Paul Smith here in Kansas City?
Doesn't ring a bell.
Paul pastored Broadway Baptist Church for decades. And, it was Southern Baptist, and then he moved it into Charismatic, and then he moved it in. He just kept moving progressives. And then when he hit my age, he finally figured out he was gay and divorced his life. His granddaughter went to my church. But anyway, Paul's written a couple of books, and he's taken Wilber's, some of Wilber's model and translated that into more of a Christian book. So like Richard Rohr and Wilber have written forwards and afterthoughts on 2 of his books.
Well, you couldn't ask for better than that.
Yeah. So, like Paul is a friend. He's in his early 80s now. But, I've interviewed Paul on here too.
Oh, I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, it's a good interview. He's a fascinating journey himself, So anyway.
Very cool.
Okay, so... Man, where do I want to go from here? Bhakti yogi.
Yeah.
Bhakti. Tell us what is that?
So, I think I talked about in my life having some struggles with divinity, with the internal Christian polemics, and my best friends growing up were Hindu, very devout Hindus. They owned a couple businesses in town, and I'd go play cricket with them in their parking lot and eat food with their parents. This mom would make wonderful Indian food, and then go to the Hindu temple and all these things. So I had this influence of these really holy people who were really devout and pious, good folks who somehow in the metrics of a lot of the religion I'd been exposed to were not going to make it. That was a big problem for me growing up. And so, kind of entered high school, went to this not atheistic, but certainly non-theistic tradition, which is Buddhism, and just kind of put that on the back burner. At some point I realized that I needed to figure out where I was with this theology thing. Like, all right, so this question about God or not God, where are we with that? And some of the people I'd met that were most convicted, I think, in a tangible way of a belief in a deity, a personified deity, or the bhakti yogis. So bhakti means devotion. That's one of the 4 traditional schools of yoga. There's, karma yoga, which is just being an ethical person in the world, good business practices, treating people well, reaping the rewards of what you sow, sort of thing. There's jnana yoga, which is the intellectual side, trying to discern the Buddhist path, what is the nature of reality through intellectual permutation. And of course, there's bhakti, this path of just devotion. Certainly it's scholarly, it has those elements, but at its heart, it's about seva, service, and bhakti, devotion. So it's a form of Hinduism that is really just about that. Everything you do, devoting your life to God. Before you even, eat your food, you actually prepare food for God and offer it to God, and you eat the remnants, the prasad, what's left over, and everything is within that container. So spent a lot of time running around India, right, with the bhakti yogis and trying to pick up what they were putting out.
Are all the yoga traditions, and are there as many yoga traditions as there are Buddhist traditions?
Yeah, that's hard to say. There's 2 forms of yoga, right? There's, if we want to be broad about it, there's spirituality yoga, the thing that we might think of. And then there's the modern physical sort of practice, the asanas. The physical practice, that has its roots into antiquity, but really was kind of like a turn of the century thing that was exported to the West.
Okay.
There's thousands and thousands of schools, because every white dude, if I can, has one, that gets some credentials and ability to market something, will do it. And they often fall on their face. So there's thousands of schools of that physical exercise yoga, usually with a trademark after them, and fewer schools of what you might think of as the streams of yogic philosophy and spiritual practice.
And would all of those flow out of Hinduism?
Yeah, and we should say that Hinduism isn't a thing. It doesn't exist. Hinduism is an academic catch-all that's convenient to kind of capture this stream of spirituality that comes out of the Indian subcontinent over the course of 5,000 years. Okay. It's so much. If you were to put Christian sects and Buddhist sects together, they still couldn't touch on the diversity of Hinduism.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Interesting. So you've got 3 books out that came just boom, 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 right?
Right. Yeah.
22, 23, 24, Zen Happiness, Zen Buddhism, and then Indian Spirituality. And that's just about ready to be released. That's coming up in April?
So actually I just found out that the second book, there's a German translation. So I'm throwing that in there. I'm counting it. Nice, so that's coming out the 15th of this month. And then May 7th, the Indian Spirituality text will hit shelves. Yeah.
Okay. And the Indian Spirituality is the one I want to read. I haven't read it yet, but in the summary, it said that you kind of given an overview of Hinduism, Jainism, correct me if I'm pronouncing these wrong, Buddhism, and Sikhism. Most Americans say Sikh.
I think Sikh is actually more preferred. So there are some Sikhs that would say Sikh.
My friends that are Sikh say Sikh.
I hear that more in America. And then you go to India and you hear more Sikh.
Oh,
so
really?
It's an internal struggle.
Okay. Well, my friends that I know are American Sikhs.
I've noted that here too.
Okay, interesting. All right. Yeah. From India, but Right. And then I think even Valerie Kaur, I don't know if you're familiar with her.
Kaur.
Yeah,
I don't know her, but I know the name.
Background is Sikh, I think.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, I have a friend that's going through, in his residency for psychiatry, who his family background is Sikh.
Very good.
So, but give us your quick 3 breakdowns of Hinduism, Jainism.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, I have another friend who's African American who grew up Black Baptist. did all of his theology degrees. Now he does a deal called Buddhi Christo, and he's a and he's I've had him on, and he's a monk and very much into Jainism.
Oh, interesting.
We discussed Jainism on this podcast.
Now I'm going to have to be mining your archive here. Yeah. So those are the 4 what we call dharmic religions of India. So those are kind of the native religions of the Indian subcontinent, or their mainstreams. It should be said that Islam has a long history in India as well, but it is not a native Indian religion. So I want to respect all of the Indian folks, the Indian spirituality that is Islam, but it's not a dharmic religion. So the dharmic religions, Hinduism, like I said, is kind of this academic catch-all term for this stream of thinking that goes back to the pre-written, pre-verbal history, even in a way. Just the antiquity of the Indian subcontinent. And there's so many varieties of it. The basic supposition, if I were to try to sum it up and do some justice, is that you're a soul, not a body, right? So that there's a spirit soul that is more real than anything that physical or material matter can even hope to reflect. The problem with that is that material consciousness is where we live, breathe, move, and have our being, as we might say in the Catholic tradition. But unfortunately is often less than satisfactory and causes us a lot of problems when we overly identify with it. So the Hindu stream of thought, and this carries over into all the dharmic religions, is that soul needs to be liberated. Liberation is called moksha. It needs to be liberated from material consciousness, re-enjoyed eternity with God, the supreme ultimate nature of God, which...
And by the way, I was taking a Hebrew class at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and there was a gal in there who was from India who was Hindu, taking a Hebrew class at Midwestern Baptist Theological
Seminary. I teach at Central, and we get some diversity like that too.
And I was talking to her, she thinks that the ancient Hindu tradition of Brahman is monotheistic. That was her take on it.
You can say that.
I thought that was fascinating.
There's actually,
and then with 1,000 manifestations of that God, which is all the Hindu gods, right?
There is a strong monotheistic current in Hinduism.
Okay.
But again, you have to take a wide view and know where you're taking the view from. But it's there.
Interesting.
But that supreme personality of God as a monotheistic element is usually not considered to have a personality. It's not anthropomorphic.
Right.
So it's an impersonal, you could almost say reality. Reality itself is God itself, which is all things everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
And so Hindus hope to re-enjoin that in a spiritual sense.
A radical immanence of all things. Or if you spread out incarnation, it'd be everything's incarnated.
Exactly.
In this nature of God, right?
Right. Everything is an emanation. As sunbeams to the sun, Hindus would say.
Okay.
Yeah. Part and parcel. So not the same thing, but of it. The beams are separate and identifiable.
Yeah. And I've been attracted to panentheism.
Now, pan-in, that's new to me.
Panentheism, which is it's a lot of, like, Richard Rohr considers himself a panentheist.
Okay, I can situate
and myself. So it's not pantheism where you're completely identified God and whatever this table is completely identified.
Sure.
Panentheism leans heavily into the immanence of God or the radical incarnation of God everywhere in everything.
I could situate myself there.
But still has some separateness to
some distinction.
Some distinction.
Yeah.
Versus, so it doesn't emphasize, like in your classic Christian theology, the transcendence of God who is totally other and separate.
Right.
And kind of, to me, that God falls into the classical Greek ideal concept,
for sure.
And I'm moving away from classical.
It's hard to be a Neoplatonist,
but yeah. So what is Jainism then?
So
in
Jainism,
that context?
Again, it's a variety of Hinduism in a way, because the fundamental suppositions are the same. It's just how do they apply them? So the Jains have this spiritual lineage of Tirthankaras, which are the enlightened masters that taught this dispensation of Dharma. Again, Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, Buddhism, they're all dharmic religions. Dharma, very complicated Sanskrit word, actually. We typically think of teaching.
Yeah.
But it also means internal quality, external phenomena. So it's the nature of mind. It's the nature of reality itself. It's also your station in life, what you do. It's a very complicated word, but pragmatically, this is a religious dispensation. So of these Dharmic religions, you've got this Jain dispensation, which basically follows the same thing. They have the last Jain saint, Mahavira, who was a historical character that had traits and teachings that we can trace, and basically taught a very strict form of ascetical practice. The renunciation of physical matter, staying really physically put in one place, keeping your karma extremely clear, because the goal in Jainism, probably above all else, is if you neutralize your karma, that means you're not going up or down, right? In the karmic cosmic scale here. If it becomes neutral, that's when you can escape physical existence, and then enjoin moksha, liberation, and become yourself a liberated.
Does that mean the same thing as nirvana in the Buddhist tradition? Moksha?
Pretty much, functionally, yeah. And actually, we use the term moksha as well in Buddhism.
Okay.
So, and it's interesting, each of these things relate to each other. I put them in that title of the book, kind of in their historical genesis and order. So Jainism appears in this Hindu milieu, Buddhism appears in the Jain Hindu milieu. Okay. So probably my somewhat idiosyncratic academic supposition is that the Buddha studied with Mahavira, the last Jain saint. It's too similar. The precepts and the monastic training are just they're too close to not be related. The time frame matches up. That's not a total minority report. Other people, Stephen Batchelor, famously, he wrote Buddhism Without Beliefs, Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist as well. Great books.
Have you read Robert Wright's book on why Buddhism is true?
I'm familiar with it, but I haven't read it.
I'm just curious. Yeah. I read that one.
I've heard good things.
It's an interesting take. But anyway, and then tell us about Sikh.
So Sikhism is kind of the one that's probably the most unique, the least related to the other three. Often looked at as a syncretic tradition between Islam and Hinduism. That's not really true, but certainly has elements of Mughal culture. The Mughals invaded India, but they also murdered one of the Sikh gurus famously, and that didn't win them many prizes. Sikhs are really all about seva, all about service to the world. That is their dharma. But they were also a warrior caste. They took it upon themselves as sort of an ostracized people to be defenders of religious liberty early on. So when the Mughals were massacring everybody that didn't fit into their Islamic ideal, the Sikhs were like, we'll take up swords and fight them for you Hindus, for you Buddhists, for you Jains. So the liberation theology in a dharmic sense,
Yeah, not the nonviolent.
No, they would not be afraid.
Rights,
they try to balance what's called miri and piri, so the temporal world and the spiritual world. So there's spiritual ideals and aspirations, and there's temporal realities and aspirations within them, and they don't look at them as opposites that can't be reconciled. So you can pick up a sword and defend, the lives of others and their religious liberty and still be a spiritual, God-fearing, holy person.
Okay. Yeah. So, oh man, where do I want to go with this? We're running out of time here. I could talk for hours about it.
I know, it goes quick, doesn't it?
I know. So, I want to get into, so I'm curious, you've got this other thing that you mentioned, independent sacramental movement.
Yeah.
And maybe bridge that into, because what I've noticed, I'm in a centering prayer group that comes out of it's Christian contemplative tradition that actually it's
Father Thomas Keating, Snomus Mountain Monastery.
Yeah. That's that, and Richard Rohr picked up on that. And actually one of Richard's former board members is the guy that leads the group I'm in.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah.
And I've been, and then I'm in this Vipassana, or some people call it insight meditation tradition that I'm studying with Tara Brock and Jack Kornfield. And as I study the Christian contemplative prayer thing and I study the Buddhist thing, I'm going, what's the difference? Because I'm not, and I ask people this all the time, and I still haven't gotten an answer that's satisfied. They seem so overlapped, except for the Christian language that sometimes comes with the It's almost like, to me, there's some Christians, they're afraid of being Buddhists.
I think that's exactly it.
So they call it contemplative prayer and put Christian language around, but do the same thing.
Yeah.
And then there's others that don't care if they're Buddhist or Christian either.
Judeo-Christians, right. Jew-boos, whatever the case may be. Buddhism fits easily with a lot of people.
Right.
It's a non-theistic religion, right? So it's not atheistic, it's non-theistic. It's kind of like, if I don't play tennis, that doesn't mean tennis doesn't exist. It's just I don't do it. So if you want to hang out with me and play tennis, you can do that. That's what Buddhism does really well, So the centering prayer piece, this is the unspoken reality of it, is it's directly influenced by Buddhism.
Yeah.
So
there's no way it couldn't be. As I'm looking at it.
It's a derivative.
Yeah.
It's a modern derivative.
Yeah.
But
it does date back into the Middle Ages.
Well,
at least,
the problem with this is there's no contiguous transmission.
Okay.
So it's a reinterpretation through kind of a Buddhist-inspired lens of ancient Christian practices. Now, I'd say at the language of the mystics, we're all doing the same thing.
I think so too.
If you study the mystics of any tradition, it's like, they're talking about the same thing.
Right. Union being the huge component to all of it, and everything's. Yeah.
Right.
Anyway,
I think the difference with Buddhism that has made it portable and accessible to these environments is that it's a practice. It's not a belief system. It's not orthodoxy. It's orthopraxy, right? So that bolts on everywhere. And a lot of these in the probably from Vatican II on up, certainly when Pope John the 23rd invited interfaith and ecumenical dialogue, and the Roman Catholic Church stopped, damning everybody that wasn't within the church to hell. That was there's a document, Nostra Aetate, the Christian church's relationship to non-Christian traditions. The Roman Catholics officially said Jews aren't horrible, and also everybody else, they have pieces of God's emanation as well. And those things that are holy and true, we should accept and live to.
Yeah.
My order.
It's a deep type pluralism. Would you
very
call
much
that?
So. Yeah.
And who were some of the big Catholic theologians that really pressed into that when that was made okay? Would that be?
I think that was a huge. I mean, certainly. Keating was around that time doing that center at the genesis of centering prayer.
Mm-hmm.
There was tons of intermonastic dialogue, so a lot of this stuff happened on a smaller scale. It wasn't being the big academic theologians that kind of came later. But this influenced Protestantism as well.
Yeah.
These great voices like Tillich, undeniable influence to that pluralism and
even John Cobb Jr. I think,
who's not familiar to me. So I have to take your word
for it. He's a big process theologian.
Okay,
He came out of the Charles Hartshorne and Whitehead process theology tradition. Anyway,
I'm a little more familiar with that arena. So, where I think I've got 5 streams.
No,
so where do you want to go with that?
So, the independent sacramental movement. What is that?
So that is a stream of liturgical Christianity that really dates back to the separation of the Dutch Roman Catholic Church from the Roman Catholic Church over issues of papal infallibility and the ability to elect their own bishops and things like that. So the genesis was the old Roman Catholic Church in the Netherlands it got into a fight with the Pope, and they wanted to elect their own bishop. The Pope wasn't having it. He wanted to give them somebody. Said, well, we're going to do it anyway. We don't historically need you. There's this titular Bishop of Babylon that got shipwrecked in the Netherlands and consecrated this bishop that they had elected, and so they could confirm their children. It was a big political mess. That denomination still exists, the Old Catholic Kirk, the Old Catholics. They found their way through a number of...
doing Latin masses and stuff.
No, they're actually super progressive. So there are branches of this that are super conservative, but the official Old Catholic, super progressive, female clergy, married clergy, they're in full communion with the Episcopal Church. They're basically Episcopalians, to put it in American terms. But that tradition made its way to the U.S., and largely because there were a bunch of disaffected Catholics who weren't Anglicans. And so they wanted to maintain their Catholicity and be able to practice that outside of the auspices of Rome. So the Old Catholics were a way to do that. That has become a very diverse, very colorful tradition over the past 100 years or so. But I found my way into it by accident, coming back from Taiwan, being homesick, deciding again I was going to foray into this sort of theological world, and eventually found myself being ordained in that tradition and pastoring a community and reconciling a lot of my, religious trauma from my childhood with my chosen suppositions and examined positions in adulthood. And still some of my best friends hang out there now.
Interesting. I wasn't even familiar with that.
There's about 1 million of us in the United States. And I'm more formally with the Episcopalians these days, but for a number of reasons. But it's a beautiful tradition.
Okay.
Sometimes too colorful.
All right. So let's. So that gives people everybody you can see. And plus he's part of the Mint, so he's easily probably one of the highest IQs I've ever interviewed. Okay, so, but man, it's fun to you've got. Yeah, you're not dull and boring. And I love.
Well, that's always good to hear.
Yeah, most
bookish kids like myself need to hear that.
There's a lot of nerdy people who just aren't interesting. And it's like, this is fun. So so this has been a curiosity to me since my research, because I grew up Southern Baptist and I was in sort of a charismatic evangelical movement, and then now I'm probably a process guy now. But at any rate, Zen Jesus. And I don't even know if that's a thing. But what's fascinating to me is, I always read Jesus through the eyes of Judaism, monotheistic, right? And so, like when he said things that sound like he was claiming to be God incarnate on earth, then he's the only unique incarnation of God in flesh and blood, right?
Born unique of the soteriological event in history.
Born of the Virgin Mary and all this kind of stuff. But I wouldn't walk around saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father. And, of course, I was very schooled in C.S. Lewis's Lord, Liar, Lunatic, and all these kind of things. But now that I'm reading, a lot of other stuff, and I go back and read some of Jesus' sayings, and then I'm like going, I wonder, Buddha lived 500-600 years before Jesus. I wonder if some of those teachings made their way to the Middle East, to Palestine, and did Jesus ever interact with some of those? Because if you read some of his stuff, it could fit really easily into a more Buddhist philosophical context rather than a Jewish monotheistic context. And perhaps was even why he was so controversial, and people
I think so.
accused him of blasphemy. He said stuff that
you couldn't say.
You don't say that.
Right.
If you're sane, you don't say that.
No, that's complex. I mean, there are some scholars. I think I hesitate to use the word scholars. I think they want more imaginatively, would love for the lost years of Jesus between his childhood and 33 to have gone, into what we know as the Thomasine missional area and encountered the East and the Silk Road. Which, I mean, that was happening, right? Like Buddhists, and
the disciple Thomas, by the way, is said to have gone to the East and evangelized the East.
And so the churches of India still largely trace their history back to St. Thomas's apostolic ministry. So, the first Buddhist statuary was Greco-Roman in style because it was transmitted along those lines. But personally, I think we have no evidence to say that happened. And I think Jesus' message is sufficiently unique. And I love that because Jesus is saying some of the same things, right? And so what that tells us again is that, as Richard Rohr would say, there's this perennial message that occurs time and time again throughout history. That's, you could say in theistic language, God making God's self known to people through our faculties. And then I'm getting into some heretical Christology here, but it works.
High Christology, low Christology.
And I think you can bridge both, which is perhaps my weird understanding.
Instead of doing a hierarchy, do it sideways.
Well, even like a continuum rather than a linear, polarity, I think.
That can work too.
But Jesus was without any question a mystic, and again, the mystics are always speaking the same language regardless of where it's situated.
You can't read John 17, the high priestly prayer that may you be one as the Father and I are one. I mean, it's all the oneness stuff, right?
Well, and beyond that, even beyond the synoptic and John's gospel, if you look at the history of the church, it was conciliar. We were voting on what's true about Jesus, what's heretical about Jesus, and the number of people that said this was true, however many hundred years now by the Fourth Council, whatever. The Gospels are written
was
7 years later.
Was the Minority Report actually correct?
The reality. Well, because you look at the Gospel of Thomas, for instance, which is a fascinating wisdom text, not included in the official canon of Protestantism or Catholicity, but you read that text and it's like, holy crap, this is a guy that got it. He got what everybody is saying and did it really well. And pieces of that are still in sort of conciliar Gospels.
My professors just kind of dismissed, it's Gnostic.
But, and it's not even a Gnostic text, which is my frustration. Like, it was in the Nag Hammadi library. It is, however, not a Gnostic text.
It doesn't teach the Gnostic
worldview, right?
The
pleroma and all of this. So Jesus was a mystic. The mystics have it figured out. Let's all do that.
I'm there. I'm there. All right. So then help me out with this, okay? Because we're going to go over a little bit. That's cool.
Yeah.
So evil. Evil.
Throwing some theodicy at me, aren't we?
Right? Yeah. This is challenging because my friends in the process world are, like, one of my friends just wrote a book. He's a Nazarene who's going to get kicked out because he's LGBTQ plus affirming. And he just wrote a book called The Death of Omnipotence.
Oof, can't say that.
And then he's coined the term omnipotence. Amy being love.
Yeah.
And most process theologians argue for an uncontrolling, loving God. That would be so God is always co-creating, but he doesn't act unilaterally. Mm-hmm. So omnipotence dies 1,000 deaths because, if you just start thinking about what God can't do, even if you're a Calvinist, Calvinists would, if you drill them down, there's still things that Calvinists say God can't do, right?
Yeah.
So then you just start going what God can't. And then when you get into suffering and the problem of evil, that's where it's so hard to hang on to an omnipotent God who who has all
Some
power.
would say it's impossible.
And I feel that way. If God just stands by and watches the Holocaust and doesn't do anything about it, that's kind of
all for some sort of melodrama that's playing out in the heavens that actually never makes its way into our modern lives.
Do we want to worship a God who sends his kids to hell, her kids to hell for all eternity? And it's just you just get into these weird concepts. I want God. My new verse, I memorized thousands of verses. Conservative, evangelical, and
Catholics. We don't.
But I memorized the Word of God, and but my new one that I've only memorized one the last 4 years.
Yeah.
It's 1 John 4:16. God is love. Those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. Mm-hmm. And that's where I want to. If I'm going to build an idea of God, but evil is still really hard to deal with in a theodicy thing. And then if I understand, say, Buddhism, it's almost like it doesn't exist.
It's a non-issue. Which is not to say that things are not, that couldn't be cast as evil,
but they still talk about doing no harm.
We would talk about skillful versus unskillful.
Okay.
Right? So, or Zen Master Sung San in his broken, but I think often succinct English would say.
But for our audience, in the Buddhist tradition, really, everything is as it is, and you have to deal with life on reality and on reality's terms, and everything's always a mixture.
Yeah.
Everything's always impermanent, right?
Impermanent and insubstantial. Doesn't really have a finite self-nature that you can pin it down to.
Exactly. So it really almost like evil doesn't exist, and that's where you get in the idea, well, then suffering really doesn't.
And we would say that's also true. But I mean, there's this important doctrine in Buddhism.
So that's where I bump into, because I'm like in justice and I see in the world and there's suffering.
Well, it's Miri and Piri we talked about in Sikhism, right? The temporal and the spiritual. In Buddhism, we talk about rupa and shunyata, form and emptiness. There's sort of this dual nature that reality can be perceived through, as spiritual and everything else, good and evil. There's this binary. But at the mystical level, what we tend to see is it's more like a yin-yang, if you're familiar with that symbol, that yes, there's these two distinctive parts that you can find and you can point to. But when you start looking at the line between them, there isn't one. It's not a black line. It's not a white line. It's the nature of this mixture coming together, that there's distinctives, but also it's one thing that's inseparable. And it's all mixed up together all of the time. And all of the mystical religions, regardless of their origin or genesis, all speak about this similarly, right? And I think that the problem...
And the human experience is able to contain all of that, hold space for all of that.
It doesn't have any other option.
Yeah, right?
I mean,
but we struggle with that.
Well, back to the psychoanalysis conversation,
exactly.
Right? I think that, and I'm a therapist by day as my primary job, right?
Yeah. I need to come see you, by the way. Anyway,
when we, kenosis, what Jesus would say, self-emptying, I think that's kind of what we do.
Philippians, folks, the famous, most famous, probably ancient hymn in the whole New Testament.
It's a huge thing that we ignore.
Canonic passage. And when Jesus empties himself to become flesh and blood in this famous Philippians 2 passage.
So I'm using a little bit of creative interpretation of canonic process, right? But when we do this self-emptying, which I think is becoming transparent, at least with ourselves and maybe a spiritual director or God, whatever we can fathom that to be, we suddenly realize that all those pieces that seem to be irreconcilable are already reconciled within us, just not always to our conscious mind, And that's heavy lifting. Because we all have these pieces within ourselves that could be cast contextually or out of context, probably more likely, as evil. These impulses, these things we've done, right? But then it's like in our life, do we view ourselves as evil? Well, probably not. But in my philosophical schema, I need that to exist.
If you grew up like I did,
I
was pretty convinced from
Total
the Southern
depravity
Baptist.
of man.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, you're a dirty, rotten sinner. You're only saved by grace.
But I have in my clinical practice, I think no one really goes there. They voice it, but
like I just wrote a blog called Original Blessing, which I was borrowing from Matthew Fox's masterful text, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
Original Blessing. But yeah, living out of Genesis 1 and 2, not Genesis 3, right?
Yeah, right.
And Genesis 3 is true. We experience shame. It's a human condition, but we really want to, like, what parent has a newborn kid and goes, "Oh God, what a dirty, rotten sinner"?
Well, they're there, but we know that they're missing some neural connections, So
no, it's like the most beautiful. Like, oh my God, there's a God.
I mean, wonder, and I think that we focus too much on Christology. We focus too much on I think that contemporary theologians, and the light of globalism and the internet, and being able to talk to people with a multitude of experiences through time and space now, I think we need to go back and talk patriology. What is the nature of God? Because a lot of these problems, if we're always stuck on Christology, pneumatology, the Holy Spirit and Jesus, who is it that they relate to or emanate from or part of in Trinitarian theology? When we start getting down to that, which is the heart of mysticism, a lot of these things reconcile themselves,
And you do have to, I think for healthy human beings, you do have to learn to hold all of these things, hold space for all of these things.
Either that or be ripped apart by them. That's the choice.
Exactly. And be able to do that with some gratitude and in this moment right now, with all the beauty and shit all mixed together.
All together.
It's okay.
Right. And if you don't believe it,
and I can
just step back and breathe.
And I've needed that because my meltdown came from my anxiety disorder and 30 years of insomnia, and then late in life tried to start dealing with that and got addicted to Xanax and alcohol for a couple of years. And that
human beings have been doing that since time immemorial.
That led to my great meltdown. And then my meltdown, and then how I process it didn't fit well with my evangelical past.
Right.
Because I went to the two therapy models that helped me the most after my meltdown were DBT, and that's what got me into that's what got me into mindful meditation.
So the lady that founded Marcia Linehan is a Zen master.
Yeah, I know. And Amy Tibbetts, who founded Lilac Centers here in Kansas City, she studied with Marcia Linehan.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
and then
because she's still around, right? Yeah,
Marcia's still alive, and I hope to get her on my podcast. And then the other guy is Richard Schwartz, who founded IFS, Internal Family Systems, which DBT probably builds off a cognitive behavioral therapy model, and I think IFS maybe play around with psychoanalysis.
It's certainly psychodynamic.
Yeah. And so those two I've found really helpful.
You could ask for worse. That's a great combination.
Anyway,
the IFS stuff in particular, realizing that these disparate parts of the self that we all contain, the multitudes that we all contain, can and do speak to each other, and we can do that consciously and realize that there's a dynamic organization to the unconscious that doesn't require our effort. It just requires our awareness and acceptance. And when we become aware of ourselves as we are, reality as it is, then accept it inexorably and inevitably as it is, then we fall into accord with it spontaneously, And if you throw your cup at me, I don't look at it and be like, well, that's going to hurt and sit here. There's an instinctive accord with that reality. And when we can do those things, all of these sort of, super heady, super Western, not inspired by the rest of the world's wisdom traditions, theological suppositions, they just don't hold water. And what I would say is when the cogs of reality and the cogs of philosophy or our mental suppositions don't mesh, right? The cogs of reality always win. So it's best to figure out how to mesh with them.
And that's what leads to religious deconstruction, I think.
Yeah.
Religious trauma can like for me, both of those, religious trauma and deconstruction were, like when I'd lost all the pillars of my life and they were gone.
Right.
And then where
am I? Where's this?
Who am I? Yeah. Who have I been? Does God exist? Who have I thought I was praying to God all these years. Was I just talking to myself? It just really just messed with me, and so I've been in this process of rethinking, which is my new translation of the word repentance, metanoia,
like it.
rethinking.
Yeah.
It's kind of anyway.
Yeah, I like it.
So I've been repenting, but in a new way, rethinking.
I think there's a lot of validity to that.
Yeah. Taking me to, some of my evangelicals say, no, you're not repenting. Anyway, you wouldn't be messing with what, anyway.
If that was working that way, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Exactly, right? I'd be like praying for you, Josh.
And I'd appreciate that too, but.
And anyway. No, I still care for people. I still care for
I think that's the end result of having our heart broken and our world deconstructed. Yeah. That to me is the proof in the pudding. 1 John 4:8, God is love, right? We talked about that. Mm-hmm. After all of our self-crushing, ego-blowing, spirituality dissolving process work has happened, what we always, almost always, without exception, come back to the world with is wonder, awe, gratitude, and love as the only response to all of it.
Yeah, and the thing is I even have atheist friends who still respond with those things to the world that they live in.
They're universal. They're human.
Right.
That's reality itself. That's God.
Yeah. I think so. Well, gosh, I could go on for hours, but thank you. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. So, how can people find you? And like I say, I'm going to jump into your books, and I'm really interested in the Indian spirituality.
Sure, yeah.
But tell people how they can find you.
So my website's super easy. It's drdrjrp.com, drjrp.com, drjrp.com.
And you've got a huge, in-depth, what do they call that?
Biographies,
something. Yeah. And then, let's see, your books are featured on there.
Mm-hmm. And got a link to my blog, I think.
Yeah, your blog.
Yeah. And you can email me.
I just read your blog on mythology you posted today.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, very cool. Well, thank you for being on Spirituality Adventures. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in with us. Josh Paszkiewicz.
There it is.
And, by the way, you have I guess in the Buddhist tradition, do you have a mentor that gives you a new name?
Almost, yeah. I've had that happen 4 times in my life.
And so your name, I couldn't say.
So probably the one that I think you drew from my website probably is Shunyananda.
Yes.
So that one actually, it was
that's
kind
how
of a
you
joke.
Signed off your blog.
Yeah.
Shunyananda.
Yeah, it's still sort of my.
And what does that mean?
It literally means bliss in nothing. It was a joke from at one point actually in my spiritual journey that I've kept, because Shunya means nothing, Ananda means bliss, but both of those have implications of divinity. So Ananda is the bliss of God, and Shunya is the 0 point that all else dissolves into reality itself, which is also the divine. So it's a funny joke that stuck with me, and I've appreciated it.
Okay, cool. All right, folks, take care. See you next time. Hey, you made it to the end. Thanks for listening all the way through on this episode. By the way, if you're not already a supporter, go to spiritualityadventures.com, sign up for one of our monthly supports, and you will receive our bonus content. You'll receive lots of interesting information about our guests. Many of our musicians will do special bonus songs and record a song. So I want to encourage you to do that. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Be sure and subscribe. Be sure and share any of the episodes that you like. And be sure and make comments if you like them as well. This helps us get Spirituality Adventures out there to more listeners, more watchers. So whatever platform you're using, subscribe, like, share, make comments, and go to our website, sign up for our team, and be a part of the team support. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.